Okay, hello everyone. I'm Julie Wiskirchen from the authors team in Santa Monica, and today I'm excited to welcome Edward Humes. Edward is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist and the author of 9 critically acclaimed books of nonfiction. Most recently, he wrote Monkey Girl, Evolution, Education, Religion, and the Battle for America's Soul, and Over Here, How the GI Bill Transformed the American Dream. He lives in Seal Beach and is a writer-at-large for Los Angeles Magazine, and today he's going to talk about his new book, which just came out. It's called Eco-Barons, The Dreamers, Schemers, and Millionaires Who Are Saving Our Planet. Please welcome Edward Humes.
Well, thank you. Well, let me start by telling you about a contest that NASA used to sponsor called SpaceSet. Did it for many years, and this was a competition in which high school students around the world tried to design the very best colony for living on Mars or the moon. And they had to use current science, current engineering. They couldn't just have science fiction aspects to their designs. It had to be something that you could build right now if you had the will and the budgets, which of course we don't, to actually construct. Now, it turns out that the winners of these contests had some common elements in them that are very instructive for how we live here on Earth and for how we look at the way to construct societies and settlements. For instance, not a single one of the winning entries in this SpaceSet competition distributed vehicles to their population that put toxic substances into their breathing air. Not a single one of those colonies routinely dumped their biological and chemical waste in their drinking water. None of them converted 30% of the planetary surface to produce a single type of food that was unhealthful to eat in large quantities. And none of them designed buildings and vehicles and transportation systems and appliances that were by design inefficient. Basically, these kids looked at how we live here on Earth and did exactly the opposite of everything that we do routinely every day. Because conservation and sustainability and clean energy aren't just nice things with which to contemplate how nice it would be if you had them on the planet Mars, or on the moon. Such considerations are a matter of life and death. Sometimes you need a little distance. I like this metaphor because it gives you that 238,000 miles distance to the moon to consider the impact of the way we live, and the idea that maybe if it's insane to live that way on Mars as we do here, maybe it's insane to live that way here as well. That's the context in which the people that I write about in Eco-Barons really live, because for many years, sometimes decades, they've kind of gotten this idea that very few of us can see, because it's all we know, that there's key aspects to the way that we live that are pretty much nuts. We flush away more fresh drinking water than most countries have to offer their entire populations to drink. We have vehicles that waste 80% of the energy that we put into it. We don't really think about that because it's just all we know. The men and women that I've labeled eco-barons, the idea that they're kind of the opposite of the old robber barons, visionary, yes, but rape and pillage, no, when it comes to the landscape. They have really put their money where their mouth is when it comes to trying to counter some of what they see as our insane lifestyle. Mostly they grumble and think how much further could we be now if we had gotten the ball rolling on climate, on deforestation, and on clean transportation years ago when they first were starting to think about it. I look at what they've done and see how much farther behind we would be were it not for their efforts. Working on this book has helped me deal with the kind of paralysis that I felt when I read the environmental bad news that we seem to be inundated with all the time, the extinctions, climate change. I don't know if you've seen or read An Inconvenient Truth when it came out, but I walked out of the theater kind of hunched over thinking, oh my God, we're doomed. That led me to wonder if there was a way to get into this huge story, the environmental story, maybe, not maybe, definitely the biggest concern of our era, one that will still be with us when the economy is back on a better track. Is there a way into that story that's a little more human, a little less paralyzing, a little more graspable than the normal gloom and doom approach? And I began searching for that story, and led me to these men and women I call eco-barons, eco-barons. So let me tell you a little bit about a couple of them. I won't go through the whole cast of characters, but they run the gamut from those who have enormous resources to devote to their passion for environmentalism to individuals who have relatively few resources and yet have found a way to have a large impact. Let me tell you about Doug Tompkins. He's the first person you meet if you read Eco Barons. He was a mountain climber was his passion. He's an outdoorsman, and so has that take on nature. He says the only time as a young man that he ever felt comfortable when he was out in nature, sleeping on a cliff somewhere, getting ready to complete a climb. When he was a young man, his climbing buddy was Yvon Chouinard, who would go on to be CEO and founder of the Patagonia Company. When they first knew each other, Yvon Chouinard was driving around in a beaten-up old station wagon with an anvil, and he'd make these pitons that he would sell to other climbers for $1.50 a piece, so he could buy some dented canned food, sometimes cat food, to live off of. So he had a very modest start in life, as did his friend Doug Tompkins. Tompkins scraped together about $5,000 when he was living in the Bay Area to start a little business he called the North Face. At that time, he founded it. It was a single shop that sold climbing gear and other outdoor equipment. When they had the opening, they found this unknown little band to play next to the wine and cheese and entertain the new customers. The Grateful Dead, it was called. Got to start at the North Face. The business gained some steam, but he sold it off, and so he could go off on a climbing expedition with Chouinard and some other folks. And when he returned, his wife had started a business selling clothing she was making in the kitchen to boutiques in the Bay Area. And he saw potential for a new business there, so they started a company and called it Esprit. And it became the leading fashion global enterprise in the late 70s and 80s. Made a ton of money. He was its CEO. He called himself its image director. And as his business and wealth grew, he became increasingly dissatisfied with the effect his enterprises were having on the natural world that he so valued. And he started trying to change the footprint of the Esprit company, even before anyone talked about green at all as a way of, as an adjective to describe a business. He was using recycled timbers for his headquarters. He started putting tags on entire fashion lines that said, "Do you really need this? Buy only what you need." His board of directors was going insane. He was literally telling his consumers to be, his customers to be less consumptive and to perhaps keep their clothes longer. Counterintuitively, it was a very successful campaign. People bought more stuff, and they had for that particular fashion line. This wasn't really satisfying his environmental yearnings. As he describes it, I was on the wrong side of things. I needed to be on the solutions side. So he sold his business to his wife, bailed out, hundreds of millions of dollars in the bank, and picked up from the Bay Area and relocated on a broken down old ranch next to a fjord in Chile. in Patagonia, in Chile, and moved into a cabin home with no electricity, no refrigerator, few of the comforts that he was so accustomed to, and began clearing the stumps off this old ranch and restoring the wilderness. Turns out that land was going cheap back then in Patagonia because in Chile, the dictator, Augusto Pinochet, had recently left office, and all his cronies who had bought up all the land in that area in hopes that he would carry through on his plan to develop the region and knock down the forests and build new cities. They were just waiting. When Pinochet left, they were kind of holding the bag, and they sold off this land at such a price that Tompkins saw an opportunity to do something there that he couldn't do anywhere else in the world, which is buy up amounts of land that were larger than the entire area of the city of San Francisco for the price of a condo in San Francisco. You know, whole forests, whole habitats where species of trees, the Alerce, that are the oldest living organisms on the planet, 3,500 years old. It takes 1,000 years for them just to mature. It's the last place where they grow in a wild fashion. And he could just walk in and buy it. So he started buying land, not just to live on, but to conserve. At first, he was welcomed with open arms because foreign investors in land are in Chile, which the Reagan administration always called the Chilean miracle because they were totally laissez-faire in every respect in terms of their economy. They welcomed the foreign investor. And Tompkins was buying and buying, and people started wondering, why isn't he cutting down trees? Why isn't he drilling or extracting minerals or building? And he said, oh, no, I'm going to keep it just like it is. I'm building a park, and I'm building a wilderness sanctuary, and I'm going to give it away. Well, as soon as he said give it away, they knew he was up to something. There was no history of that kind of philanthropy in Latin America at that time. And so surely he had an ulterior motive, and the rumors began, and the investigations began, and the helicopters from the military began hovering over his property. And he was threatened with deportation because he must be a CIA spy. No, maybe he was building a new Israel, a new homeland for the Jewish people. No, he was tunneling under the Andes so that the dreaded Argentine army could finally advance on Chile and take over, as the Chileans had often feared. He joked to his second wife, Chris, every morning and say, hey, let's get up and get to work on that tunnel, Chris. And it turns out that this kind of philanthropy has often been greeted with that sort of hostility. It's a common reaction. When Rockefeller wanted to buy up the land and donate it for creating a Grand Tetons National Park, he was burned in effigy in Wyoming. There were mobs and threats of violence. In order to accumulate the land, he had to do it under dummy corporations and other buyers. And even after he had amassed it and gave the land, offered it up to the Roosevelt administration, Franklin Roosevelt administration, he couldn't do anything for 10 years because there was such opposition in Congress. Now, of course, they'd burn you in effigy and have mobs if you tried to take the park away. But at the time, it was considered an attack upon property rights and the order of things. You just didn't give away land just to keep it as it is, to preserve nature. But just as the attitude here shifted, things have begun to change in terms of how Tompkins's efforts have been viewed. And between he and his wife, Chris, who was one of the 4 original employees of the Patagonia company and who ultimately became its CEO, she left to marry him and to join in his efforts. They have created, or are creating, 11 national parks, wildlife preserves, wildlife corridors that connect once separated habitats to restore migratory patterns. And they've been returning endangered species to environments from which they once inhabited but have been extirpated from. All in all, about 2 million acres of temperate rainforest, more than any other individuals on the planet have preserved, have been obtained and conserved and donated to trusts or directly to government park services by the Tompkinses. Enormous impact, because much of this area would have been threatened with the kind of deforestation that we're seeing in Brazil now to accommodate livestock and corn-based biofuels and that sort of thing. So they have had a huge impact on conservation in that part of the world where no one was engaged in that activity up until their entry into it. It's only a piece of what they're doing, because they've also, in obtaining this land, they've traded low-value conservation land with landholders there who wanted to continue farming and help them establish organic and sustainable farming economies, so that there's now a local economy in place in this region that didn't exist before, where only extraction and exploitation of the natural resources were a ready means of making a living. And the third component of what they're doing was to establish a foundation that has given millions to environmental groups here in the States and elsewhere in the world, which is how I found out about the next group of eco-barons I want to tell you about, because they're at the opposite end of the spectrum. Very little financial resources, but very large impact. Tompkins was one of their early supporters. It's a group called the Center for Biological Diversity. Most of you probably haven't heard of them, but you're almost certainly familiar with their work. They are the champions of the Endangered Species Act, and in their most recent high-profile case involved the Bush administration and the polar bear. This is the group that compelled, through science and through legal action, compelled the Bush administration not only to designate the polar bear as a threatened species that must be protected from an extinction threat, but the extinction threat that the administration was compelled to acknowledge was human-caused global warming, which the administration really hadn't conceded even existed until this point. Now, to back up a little bit, how the folks at this center got their start, it began with two, well, I call them owl hooters. These were Forest Service contractors who would go out into the forest, in their case in the Gila National Forest in New Mexico, at night searching for spotted owls. And they'd go out and they'd hoot like owls. And one of them was good enough at it that they could carry a dead mouse, and the owl, when they called it, would swoop down and snatch the mouse from their hands, which, if you're an owl hooter, is apparently a big highlight. And the goal was, because these owls were endangered, and their threat, the main threat to their continued existence, was the logging of their forest habitat, which was being done at an alarming rate because the policy in place from President Reagan and his Interior Secretary, James Watt, who I think his middle name was Chainsaw, if I remember it correctly, was to treat our national forests as wood baskets, to wisely use the resources was the term of art, but use was the operative word. The only barrier to that would be the law, being the Endangered Species Act, requirement that you don't drive entire species into extinction while you're wisely using these public resources. Hence, the need for owl hooters. If these endangered owls were there, then you couldn't cut the trees. Well, one day, Peter Galvin and Karan Suckling, who were two ace owl hooters, are out. And these are guys who loved what they were doing, but had no money. In fact, they had to dicker with their landlord over the rent for their unelectrified cabin in the wilderness. Should it be $14 a month, as they felt, or $17 a month as the landlord? That was the kind of financial situation that these guys lived in. They're out wandering at night, and as you can imagine, in a wild national forest, it can get difficult to maintain your bearings, and they strayed off course a little bit, but found owls. They looked up, and there were these eyes looking back at them, responding to their calls, the Mexican spotted owl. So they raced back to their headquarters and pored over maps to try to figure out exactly where they were. And to their shock, they found out that they were right in the middle of what was to be the largest timber sale in a national forest in the history of the Southwest, which now, of course, would have to be halted if the law was to be observed. So they go to their supervisors and they say, yeah, right, we're really going to stop the biggest timber sale in history because you found a couple owls. Forget about it. Their protests to that decision were not acknowledged, or mostly where they were laughed at. And that kind of ended their career with government employment, because they went public with their findings and filed a petition under the Endangered Species Act to halt this logging operation. And the interesting thing about this act, that's been around since 1973, that Richard Nixon signed, actually, and celebrated as our environmental awakening, and the US Senate approved unanimously. Most people think the Endangered Species Act is kind of a liberal plot, but actually it was, when it passed, was a bipartisan common sense measure to stop things like the bald eagle from going extinct. Well, the great thing about this act, if you think protecting endangered species is a good idea, is that any US citizen anywhere in the country has standing to object and to file a petition to halt an action by the government that they believe is driving a species into extinction. You don't need any special status. You don't need a lawyer. You don't need to be anything other than a US citizen who has a legitimate objection. And the government must acknowledge and respond to your claim. And if you have, as these guys did, years of research on endangered species in the southwestern forest that they had accumulated during their time as owl hooters, you know more than the people that you're up against, as they did. And they won. They won the case. And not only did they cause that single timber sale to be halted, the government and the timber industry overreacted so wildly to this one case that by the time the dust settled and the appeals had been fought, all of the forests of the Southwest, 15 of them, national forests, were under protection. And habitats in there covering millions of acres were being preserved by court order, because it turned out that the government had been routinely violating the Endangered Species Act routinely and systematically for over a decade. So suddenly, this law that had been on the books for a number of years and no one had bothered to try to enforce it had become a powerful tool for preserving species and preserving nature. And these guys had the recipe for doing it. So that led to the creation of this Center for Biological Diversity. And since the late 80s, no organization has been more effective or has brought about the protection of more endangered species than these guys. They now have about 60 scientists and lawyers working all across the country on these cases. And the one that they had been working towards most recently, the polar bear case that I told you about earlier, is now at the center of their efforts. They're still operating on a shoestring. They have a lot less money than the more established environmental organizations, but they have arguably been far more effective. And their goal now is to use this decision on the polar bear and related Arctic species as a means of attacking global warming. They have created a climate law institute just to use this finding by the Bush administration as a turning point in how we deal with climate change. And this is the part of the story that really hasn't come out. The polar bear decision got a lot of press. It's kind of like the rock star of endangered animals. Everybody loves polar bears, I guess. But the real breakthrough here is that once this finding is made, if you actually obey the provisions of the Endangered Species Act, which is to mitigate or eliminate the threat that causes species to go extinct, then everything is in place now without Congress having to take another step, without all the contentious votes over cap and trade or renewable energy. No further legislation is needed to act on this part of the equation. If the federal government is obeying the law and is considering approving a new power plant? Should it be coal or should it be renewable energy or something else? It's one of the things it has to respond to is this concern over climate change driving species into extinction. And the law requires them to reduce that threat as much as possible. That goes for any action the federal government may take on approving a new road project, on anything that has a measurable climate change footprint. It doesn't mean those things can't happen and can't go forward, but to obey the law, their impact on climate change has to be minimized. Now, if that takes Congress out of the equation, then it's up to the White House to use this new tool to begin constructing a response to climate change. There's actually the legal ability for the president to act in a very visible and substantial way without any further legislation needed. And because there will be many voices suggesting that now is not the time to do that, it will be interesting to see how that plays out. Because if we're really going to follow the law, if we accept that we're driving species into extinction, the structure exists now to respond to that in a way that could be a turning point in the effort to ameliorate the climate change, our greenhouse gas emissions. So the people at the center say, you know, there's the possibility, don't know for sure, but these old owl hooters say this could be the turning point in whether or not we get serious about fighting global warming and doing something measurable. Because if we're really following the law, we really don't have any choice. We need to start acting. And no excuse, no economic consideration can impede that action, because one of the other aspects of the Endangered Species Act is that you can't elevate economic or political considerations above scientific ones. Chief Justice Warren Burger ruled on this. So he wrote the opinion in which the Supreme Court affirmed the Endangered Species Act many years ago. And he said, you know, a shopping mall, a road, all of those have monetary value. They come and go. Extinction is forever. You can't put a price tag on extinction. Once the spotted owls are gone, once the polar bears are gone, there's no coming back from that. And therefore, the science of extinction is the touchstone. So if the nation wishes to act decisively against global warming, the tool is there right now to get started. So this is only just beginning to penetrate the legal and environmental community, that we're actually further along in terms of what the law permits than anyone has previously realized. And the irony, of course, is it's a decision by the Bush administration, which opposed having a national climate change policy, that inadvertently has opened the door to this. So the people at the Center for Biological Diversity, which is headquartered in Tucson, are very excited about this. The people who think that they are, you know, the worst thing since Satan are pretty upset about this. But it's one of the battles that are going to play out in the next few years and will be very significant. You know, I don't want to take any more time going into the different characters in eco-barons. Just briefly, there's, I think I could write an encyclopedia called the eco-barons. The people that I profile, you know, to have a book of reasonable length I had to select them. So I went for a gamut, from the super wealthy, like the Tompkins is, or Roxanne Quimby, who's doing, the founder of Burt's Bees, who's doing in Maine what the Tompkinses are doing in Patagonia. From that end of the scale down to a guy like Terry Tamminen, who had a pool cleaning business in Malibu and became Arnold Schwarzenegger's chief environmental advisor and the architect of California's global warming legislation and energy plan. He ran into, actually, it's kind of funny, he ran into one of his old customers in the pool business, Dustin Hoffman, who said, "Glad to see you're cleaning the big pool now, Terry." And it's true. There's a guy who had no aspirations to change the world and yet found himself in a position to do so, because that climate change program of California's has spread to 29 other states through his efforts, and is very powerful. From a guy like Terry, who has now political connections, all the way to a single mom named Carol Allen in Texas, who's a retired juvenile probation department employee. She saved an entire species of sea turtles from extinction, took on the shrimp industry, endured death threats and hate mail, and won with nothing more than a group of school children standing behind her, because it was her passion to try and stop the extinction of one of the oldest surviving species on the planet. It goes back to the fairly unchanged from the age of dinosaurs, sea turtles. Very inspiring group of people, and as I said, made me feel much more hopeful about where we are on the environmental front, just by seeing them in action. And it's not just because of their good works, but it's because of the example they set of countering the sense of helplessness and weight that our environmental problems bring to us. I asked Tompkins if he ever felt discouraged. He says, yeah, I often get up and just feel like it's just too damn late. We're not going to be able to fix things no matter what we do. And then he just sort of leaned back and crossed his arms, and I said, well, so why do you keep doing it? Because I may be wrong. So it's, that's what passes for optimism from him, and I think it's an apt slogan. We may be wrong. Maybe it's not too late. There's one more person I want to tell you about before I close that I profile in the book, Andy Frank. And this is a guy I wish President Obama could talk to. They call him the father of the plug-in hybrid car. He was building them before anybody alive heard of them. And he does it with college students at UC Davis. Builds these incredible cars, conversions mostly, some from scratch. I like his story because it's the perfect counter to the notion that paying attention to climate and to environment that now is not the time because of our economic recession, our hardship. It would be foolish to pay attention to these issues. And of course, Andy says, well, this are the same people in good times who say it's not the right time to sacrifice our global leadership on the economy to pay attention to the environment. It's never really the right time to do these things. Andy can take a Chevy Suburban and turn it into an 80-mile range hybrid electric car, twice as good as anything Detroit has on the books. 150 mile per gallon effective vehicle, 0 emissions for those first 80 miles. And he said, if I can build these with college students, and they don't cost a lot of money, it's all off-the-shelf parts. It's not exotic technology, and he's been building these as prototypes for automakers for many years, and they just sort of disappear. But I've seen these vehicles, I've driven in them, and they're real. The barrier isn't technological, and it's not economic to having them. It gets back to this idea that we live sort of in this insane lifestyle that we can't really see that it's insane, nor can we see that an alternative would be not only comparable, but potentially more prosperous and more, certainly cleaner than what we have now. That's the vision that Andy Frank has, that if we can get past the ideological and the cultural barriers to making that change, that it would be very apparent that adopting this kind of new technology and these kinds of new lifestyles would be an economic plus. It would help us emerge more quickly from not only the environmental crises we face, but the economic crises that we face. It's again a very hopeful message. I guess the hope has to be that more people start looking closely at that linkage between environment and economy, and even national security, because we're also talking about replacing fossil fuel dependence, at least in some measure, if we make that shift. That's the hope. and the message that these echo barons carry, and that I do my best to convey in the book. So thank you very much. Be happy to take some questions, and appreciate you having me. Yes?
My question actually is about a number of the characters in your book are from the West, I guess broadly defined. And so do you think that there's something about the context of the West that maybe is bringing out this interest in people? And then I guess conversely, is there something that might, in this context, if there is one, that might be preventing others elsewhere in the country from adopting some of the ideas that these people are pushing?
Well, I think in some cases the West, because of the degree to which the natural world still persists here, offers some opportunities that to some of the characters in my book that they couldn't have enjoyed elsewhere. But other than that, no, I think it was my own selection process more than the reality of being in the West, although with the California exception. There's something about California that I think we've all observed where it tends to lead. It tends to be on the forward edge of many kinds of issues. I mean, we have had more stringent emissions controls on automobiles for many years than than the federal government requires, mostly as a matter of survival and wanting to make the air look less like chocolate pudding in Los Angeles. But beyond that California exception, I think these urges are more universal. And although many of the characters in my book have a connection to the West, they're from all over the place originally. So. Anyone else? Yes. Oh, sorry.
So one thing that interests me is the research process for the book. How did you go about contacting these people, finding out who they were, the impact, and so forth?
Well, it's kind of pretty much the old-fashioned way, and this is the process I use in all my books. I go one by one through the individuals I want to write about and the people who know them. I started with a close friend of the Tompkins named Peter Buckley, who's also an environmental philanthropist, and he had worked with Doug at Esprit, and he gave me a great deal of information about their work together, and then also provided the introduction to the Tompkinses. So I got to know them that way and spent time with them. And then it's a matter of talking to others who are engaged in work with them or who are aware of their impact and have, Henry Paulson, the former Secretary of the Treasury, recently departed, but he was also involved with the Nature Conservancy. He said that no two people on the planet have had more of a commitment and more of an impact on land conservation than Doug and Chris Tompkins. That they're kind of the heirs to Rockefeller in the environmental philanthropy sense, which is high praise indeed. So that was the process I used. It's interview, visit, immerse. I met Roxanne Quimby up in the woods of Maine, where she started Bird's Bee, going with selling at country fairs. And I actually met her at one of the fairs where she used to sleep in her van and get up so she didn't have to rent a motel to go out and sell her wares. Of course, she made $500 million off that business eventually, but it's still the same kind of plain-spoken hippie chick, as she describes herself, that she's always been. So the process is also getting to know these people in some way, and to the extent that's possible when you have such a large number of characters, that's what I set out to do. Sure.
I was wondering if oh, sorry. I'll let somebody else ask a question.
Sorry?
Sure, sorry. Just wanted to hear as far as I know. So I don't know if T. Boone Pickens made it into your book, or maybe that he doesn't deserve it until a much later version. But did you talk to him at all? Is he in the book, or do you have any thoughts on the kind of work that he's been doing?
I didn't hear who you were asking about.
T. Boone Pickens?
Yes. No, he's actually not in the book. And there's many people I would define as eco-barons who aren't, because I couldn't write a set of encyclopedias. I needed to just pick and choose. And I wanted to get the range from the very wealthy to individuals who are having an impact but who don't have so much financial resource behind them. I felt that was important because I think the message that you could draw from, I don't state it explicitly, but that you could draw from from reading Eco-Barons is that improving our environmental situation is really dependent upon the impact of spread across many efforts, and it's not just our saviors just can't be the very wealthy. Doug Tompkins is the first to say that what I'm doing he says, is not going to really amount to much unless I can convince many others to follow suit. So now specifically, people like Pickens, Al Gore, other very prominent players in the environmental movement and with climate change. I didn't gravitate towards them also for the reason that I feel that the efforts are particularly well known and are already out there in the public eye. And most of the stories that I chose to follow weren't so well known. So that was also, I wanted the book to be fresh and offer a new set of storylines as well. Yes.
I had a question about, did you find that in researching, talking with these people, did they ever go through kind of introspective paralysis? Like, for instance, and not to pick on anybody or any particular technology, like one of the things that always kind of intrigued me about plug-in hybrids is the question of whether shifting power generation to, power plants instead of just, the combustion engine is actually a savings. And I feel like it's one of those things where if I were to try to do something like that, I would, even with the best of intentions, I would get frozen up trying to decide, am I doing the right thing? And did you see that happening a lot with these people, or they just kind of, move forward, gung-ho, et cetera?
Yes. Well, the global question, are they as equally paralyzed at times by the enormity of the undertaking? Absolutely. But one of these guys, these men and women are all outside the mainstream in their thinking. Tompkins is a deep ecologist, and Roxanne Quimby is kind of exists on her own plane. And on the one hand, she'll say something like, I'm a strong believer in karma, and I think we've misbehaved so badly in terms of the environment that some sort of humbling is inevitable. But then, then she'll turn around and say, but I just can't bear to see this last surviving huge forest east of the Mississippi go down. So I'm still going to do what I think I can do to save it. So it's interesting because they managed to keep that hopelessness at bay and just keep going forward. Now, specifically about the shifting from gasoline-based transportation to electricity-based, that's something that Andy Frank and others have given a lot of thought to, and I think the evidence is pretty firm that even shifting to electrical generation is a cleaner alternative, particularly in California, but even with coal-fueled electricity, which isn't common in California, it's usually much cleaner. It's still going to be a net gain on carbon footprint. And the other interesting thing about Andy's vision, which also incorporates home-based solar charging of these vehicles, he thinks the two need to go hand in hand, is the point that he stresses that the infrastructure exists now to power fleets of electrical cars, really substantial numbers of them, as many as, well, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, just with the capacity we have now, because most of our electrical generation capacity is not used throughout the day. It's only during peak periods. But what, as as has been talked about by everyone from Obama on down recently, we have a stupid electrical grid, and so it's not smart, and therefore we have to have this huge capacity all the time just to deal with peak periods. So it's plausible, feasible, that we could bring online many electrical vehicles with our existing capacity. And therefore, it has the double advantage of higher efficiency. We're actually using the capacity that we have, and ultimately cleaner energy than we get from gasoline. So, yeah, that's one where he's thought out and is convinced, and I find persuasive the evidence that I've seen that it's a much cleaner option. Not a perfect one, but a cleaner one. Yes?
Wait for the mic. This is better for the video.
Over the years, I've heard some stories and reports about this, especially in the third world places where, local communities were convinced that maintaining the local ecosystem was actually more profitable in the long run than, doing something, that made some money for a few years and then they were, be destitute. And I'm just wondering if you've gotten any sense for whether or not that mindset has gained any traction in the third world, and maybe even in industrialized countries, that there is inherent economic value, in preserving natural areas, or if it wouldn't surprise me if that was becoming more commonly accepted in the third world, but I guess I haven't seen any real evidence of that in the industrial countries. There's certainly talk about ending global warming, but I don't really hear anything about the economic value of preserving large tracts of land in a natural state. And I'm just wondering, is that something that is just not going to happen? Or am I mistaken? Is there really not an economic value per se? Is it simply an aesthetic value, or an obligation to future generations? Or
well, there isn't definitely an economic value toward some forms of conservation, and we're not talking about greening in general. You're talking about land conservation. Is that the question? Because certainly the connection between conservation in general and sustainability is being made by businesses all over. That being wasteful and inefficient is both bad for the environment and bad for the bottom line. So we're seeing that connection made. Now, it's one of the arguments in Maine that I write about has to do with the creation of a national park or a national monument out of a portion of the great Maine woods that Thoreau wrote about and tromped through, and that is still largely intact. But the current argument in Maine now is over whether portions of it should be developed with new communities, new cities, as some developers have proposed in the areas that have the highest conservation value, or whether a national park or national monument should be established, and which ultimately would be the greater economic boon, because the communities up there that had been dependent upon the timber and paper industries are all dying because those jobs have disappeared. Not because of endangered species protection, but because all those jobs have gone elsewhere in the world. And that once dominant industry has largely abandoned, not completely, but largely abandoned that area of Maine. The proponents of a park say, if you look at other communities around the country where national parks have been established, they have been a net gain for the economy, and one that is not, and again, that's not cyclic in the way the timber industry has been. And one that is dependent upon tourism, and of course that has pluses and minuses. But there's good evidence that that form of conservation, when it's coupled with a park, as well as wilderness areas that are kept that may be contiguous but aren't so accessible to the public, does offers jobs and strong economic pluses for communities. So the counter to that is that development and bringing in more residents to live also is a possible greater economic gain. Although the costs for meeting the demands of new residents must be borne locally, whereas a park is going to be borne by the state or federal government. So it's a complex argument, but there's definitely a case to be made on either side. There's a huge battle in California that you may not be aware of shaping up over a property called the Tejon Ranch. And this is an area that lies between Los Angeles and Bakersfield. And if you look at the map, it's this great big blank on the map where there's nothing essentially except a ranch that goes back to the Spanish land grant days and has been used for some cattle grazing, but is largely in its natural state. It's a historic nesting area for the California condor and other rare and endangered species. And it has a rare crossroads of 4 different biomes, the coastal, Sierra Madre, high desert, and low desert. The UN calls it one of the 25 biodiversity hotspots in the world. Only 2% of the Earth's surface qualifies for that, that it's a very important environmental area. This land has changed hands a number of times from the Chandler family, which owned it since the early 1900s, the publishers of the LA Times, to this investment group now in New York that wants to put a new city right in this wilderness area, an entire new city, an hour's drive from Los Angeles, 75,000 residents, plus a resort right where the condor nesting grounds are. And the environmental community had been adamantly opposed to this. But then, in what you'd have to call a very brilliant maneuver, the owners of the land offered a large area to be conserved, ringing their proposed development to the Sierra Club and to Audubon and some other groups that had been expressing opposition to this plan, and said, we'll give you this land if you can afford it, and it will be in trust to you to preserve if you do not drop all opposition to our plans. And six of the 7 environmental groups involved agreed and have backed off. You could probably guess that the one that opposed it is the one I profile in this book, the Center for Biological Diversity, which likens this development to a holocaust for nature. And we'll have to see what happens, because again, if you really follow both California law, that dates back to the 70s, the California Environmental Quality Act, which is being used as to regulate greenhouse gas emissions now, among other things, and the Endangered Species Act. If you actually follow the law, this kind of development is exactly the kind of thing that can't be allowed to happen because of its extreme detrimental effect, both on climate and species. So as this plays out in the courts, where it will inevitably land, this particular property, because it's so big, and because California is positioned to really, lead the nation on these kinds of questions, I think the Tejon Ranch will be the battle that decides whether we're going to change the way we think about development and sprawl, or we're just going to say, no, we're not going to intervene, business as usual will continue, and that will be a different kind of turning point in the climate battle, one where we basically surrender and say, whatever comes will come, let's just enjoy it while we can, I suppose. So that's going to be the key battle for the conservation versus development aspect of climate and species protections. And that's going to be decided in the next few years. Okay.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.